Well, today we want to talk about the disappearing Somali nose and how that is a security threat to Kenya. Ever since the Somali civil war began, Kenya received vast numbers of Somali citizens as refugees into Kenya. Some of them were placed in refugee camps along the border, but many of them were able to escape those camps and come into Kenya and, by and large, integrate within the Kenyan community. Now, as a result of this, there has been the rise of tensions between Kenyans, quote unquote, and Somalis, quote unquote. And this is the regular ethnic tension that exists within Kenya. It's nothing new. But what is different is the rise of racial tension between ethnic Kenyans, in quotes, and ethnic Somalis. And the racial component that we're talking about is that you can more or less, I think, you can identify just by looking who would be a Somali as opposed to who would be a Kenyan, in quotes again, because there is no such thing as a Kenyan. It's different ethnic groups. But there's some kind of, racial component between these two groups that can be identified. Now, what is known is that there is almost no intermixing in terms of marriage and family between ethnic Somalis and ethnic Kenyans. And part of this is the unwillingness of Somalis to mix with other groups. And Somalis refuse to mix with other groups because they insist that they are special. At least they're more special than other Africans. And there are also clans within Somalis who insist that they in fact are not Africans. Like the Isaac clan. As absurd as that sounds, they separate themselves from the rest of Africans, who they refer to as Jarir, which is not necessarily a nice word. Now, because of this, there is ethnic tension that has been increasing over time, with Kenyans, in quote, becoming more and more resentful of Somalis. And this resentment is getting worse by the day because Somalis are becoming very wealthy within Kenya. As a class and as a group of people, they really have become quite wealthy. And anytime a group of people becomes wealthy, when they are living in quote unquote a foreign land, the locals always become resentful. Now, in the case of Somali and Kenyan relationships among the ethnic groups, is that this resentment, not only is it being occasioned by jealousy, where Kenyans see that the Somalis are becoming more and more wealthier, it's also that Kenyans are feeling discriminated against by Somalis because they simply refuse to mix on a family level with what we call Kenyans. There is almost no incident of a Somali marrying a Kenyan, in quotes, or a Kenyan marrying a Somali. Whether they share the religion or not is almost irrelevant. You could be both Muslims, but a Somali will still refuse to get married to a non-Somali Muslim. And this is becoming problematic. And the danger is that we may have ethnic violence at some point in the future if this situation is not rectified right now. So we have to dig deep into understanding why this is the situation. Kenyans take rejection by Somalis very, very personally, especially male Kenyans. When they're rejected by Somali women, they take it very personally. And that greatly contributes to the overall resentment that people are feeling. But what Kenyans need to understand is Somali culture. And they don't need to be taking such rejection personally. Because within Somali culture, Somalis are divided into clans. They've divided themselves into different clans. And it rarely happens that a Somali from one clan will marry a Somali from another clan. So they, even amongst themselves, they do discriminate on the basis of clan. And in fact, many, many marriages occur within the extended family, so that you find two cousins can get married, and that is considered okay and acceptable. Now, to most Kenyans, that is not acceptable to marry your cousin. But within Somali culture, that is acceptable. In fact, the level of discrimination is so high that someone is not willing to marry outside the extended family. Forget about outside the larger tribe. We're talking about outside the extended family. Cousins marrying cousins. Now, this has resulted, because the Somali population is very small, relatively small in Kenya, and not everyone meets everyone, so that the dating pool is very, very shallow, because if you're only marrying from your large extended family, the dating pool where you're pulling your mate is very shallow. And of course, that has consequences. So, what has happened to the Somali community that is in Kenya? There are very limited options in getting married, because they won't marry a Kenyan, they will not marry from another clan, they won't marry beyond the extended family. So, with that kind of shallow dating pool, over the generations, what is happening is that we're having a very high rate of inbreeding within the Somali community. Now, inbreeding has its own consequences, because as people refuse to get an influx of new blood within themselves, and they are marrying within the same extended family, certain genetic problems occur with each succeeding generation. The children that are born begin to exhibit certain problems that are very well documented medically. So some of the problems that you get from inbreeding is, of course, genetic malformations, genetic issues from the children getting born. You also get limb malformations. You also get a decline in child cognitive abilities, up to and including mental retardation. You also get a very high incidence of mental illness. And in fact, according to the WHO and the AMISOM report that was done, over 1/3 of Somalis suffer from mental illness. And the other problem that you get from a lot of inbreeding is called facial deformation, which brings us to the topic of this talk. Have you ever noticed, by the way, that when you look at very many Somali girls, I want you to take note. Take note how small their nose is. Amongst very many Somali girls and women, their nose from one generation to another appears to be getting smaller and smaller and smaller. This is called the disappearing Somali nose, and it's very prevalent amongst women. Now, why are their noses disappearing? Why is the nose getting smaller and smaller and smaller? This is part of the inbreeding, the consequences of inbreeding that we are talking about. So that at the end of the day, when you look at the profile of some of these girls, you'll see that they have the profile of a parrotfish, or something like a beluga whale. I'm telling you, just go take note. And once you notice that, you'll realize that the rate of inbreeding is extremely high. Now, that is only on a cosmetic level. But where it becomes an existential and a security threat to Kenya and the other countries around Somalia, and also to Somalia itself, is the issue of inbred children appear to exhibit lower cognitive abilities, up to and including mental retardation. And also the fact that such children also tend to have a very high incidence of mental illness. Now, what does this mean? This means that there is a steady pipeline of recruits to the various extremist groups that are creating a lot of chaos in Somalia. Because you keep on wondering, where do they get these people who are willing to commit, to strap on a bomb and blow up a whole school or a shopping center or whatever it is? What kind of person would do that? The sort of people who would do such a thing are people with limited mental cognitive abilities, or people who are mentally retarded or slightly or on the spectrum of becoming mentally retarded. So how come there are so many people willing to join these extremist groups in a country like Somalia? Is because of the inbreeding, so that many kids are born they can't reason well. So Somali inbreeding is a security threat, not only to Somalia, but also to the countries around Somalia, because as they inbreed, they are producing new recruits for the extremist groups that are very easily influenced and paid and persuaded to go do a horrific terroristic crime. Which is why the issue of Somali inbreeding should be part of the policy of AMISOM and also of the government of Kenya, to try and persuade the local Somali leadership, even in Somalia, that they really need to intervene with the issue of inbreeding, because they are producing future terrorists through a lot of this inbreeding. Now, let's focus on Kenya. In the case of Kenya, when the Somalis moved to Kenya, maybe they believed the Ministry of Tourism, which tells everyone that Kenya has what is called the Big Five. Now, the Big Five are apparently or supposedly the important animals in the wilderness, like the lion, the elephant, I guess the rhino, and the buffalo, etc. So they're called the Big Five. And so maybe the Somalis believed the Ministry of Tourism of Kenya when it said that Kenya only has the Big Five. But in reality, Kenya has a sixth animal. And this is a very important animal. This animal in Kenya is called the hyena, but Kenyans call it the fisi. Now, the feces of Kenya, generally feast on women. You understand? So in the case of Kenya, the officials of Kenya are saying that the Somalis need to hand over at least 10% of their women. In other words, a lot of the resentments against Somalis in Kenya by Kenyans is the fact that the Kenyan men, the feces, do not have access to Somali women. And so the only way to bring a permanent peace between the different communities in Kenya is through intermarriage. So the Somali leadership needs to be persuaded to hand over at least 10% of their women to the feces of Kenya. And everyone wins. It's a win-win situation because the feces get to eat and the Somalis get the benefit of fresh and new genetic material coming into themselves, which will reduce the rate of inbred children who exhibit all these genetic problems that we talked about. Because there is no way you can move into a different country, start to prosper within that country, while denying the local people of that country access to your women. This is very, very simple. It never happens and it never ends well in history. When one group moves into the territory of another group and then they refuse to mix with the people of that group. And mixing is not just drinking together, which they don't, okay? Mixing means you create marriages of convenience, marriages which bring peace amongst the communities. You have to mix the people. At some point, you don't have to mix 100% of the people, but you have to mix at least 10% of the people. If you create very rigid racial or ethnic lines, it eventually brings violence. So the only way we can avoid future violence between people of Somali origin and people of, in quotes, Kenyan origin, is for there to be intermarriages which will bring peace. But the main obstacle to intermarriage is Somali culture and belief system that they are better or more special than other Africans, which doesn't do anything for the prospects of peace in Kenya. So in the interest of peace, and I'm only talking about this, not because I care about the feces. I don't care about the feces, one or another, but my interest is in the security threat, the long-term and medium-term security threat to Kenya, both from internal ethnic strife and from continued attack by extremists emerging from Somalia. This is why we're talking about this. We are not just talking about this for the sake of talking about this. No, our focus strictly and our interest strictly is in the security of the state. That's it. And so for us to secure the state, we have to nip in the bud what we can project as a violent situation emerging between people of Somali origin and people of non-Somali origin in Kenya because of the rigid ethnic segregation that happens between these two very, very visible groups. So the only way to bring peace is for the Somali community to hand over 10% of their women to the feces of Kenya. They should consider this as their zakat. This is what you're supposed to do at a minimum because you're making money out of Kenya, right? You're making good money. You're driving the biggest cars. You're living in the best estates. And no one is complaining. The only complaint is this: how can you come, make money out of someone's house, and you don't even throw them a bone that you're going to make all this money and walk out with it? Well, everyone else is just looking at you making money in their own house. You see, it can't work. You have to throw them something. No, that something is 10% of your women. And once you get this fresh new genetic material within yourselves, the incidences of inbreeding, inbred children will reduce, and the threat from the extremist groups will also reduce as the pipeline of recruits begins to reduce and to become shut off. It is in this way that we can bring a permanent peace to East Africa and Kenya and Somalia in particular.